Good afternoon. This is House Appropriations Committee. It is Tuesday, January 28th at 2:15, and we are here to listen to the Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner of Finance and Management to go over the fiscal year 26 budget. So, welcome.
For broadcast, if you guys go to the Finance and Management website, you can put, do you see it up there?
Yes,
Okay,
thank you.
you're welcome. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Adam Gresham, Commissioner of Finance and Management.
And Artie Merrill, Deputy Commissioner of Finance and Management.
So as is our kind of typical protocol, what we were going to do is go through using the general fund overview in this booklet and also on your screen, which would be page 14 and 15 and 16. And the way it is laid out in the overview is we begin with sources, where we're getting the money. And then we go to uses and we start off with what we call current services usage, meaning kind of doing the same thing this year as last year. And then additional initiatives that the governor wanted to put in his budget. And then we go to transfers and one-time appropriations, and then we sum it up. So my colleague and I generally, our method is we do a bit of a tag team. I start off and then hand over, and then he hands back and I hand over. So we have some fun and some rest in between our dialogue. So any questions on kind of format? Okay, then.
Adam, what do you think you need for time? I mean, we have whatever you need, but just trying to, for planning purposes, do we need a break in between? Do we just go through?
I think we can get through the body of this in probably an hour, depending, of course, on how deeply you want to dive in. We won't be able to get through the language. I'm assuming that you want to do a language session afterwards, but that's up to you. We can go through both if you want.
Let's go ahead and.
Okay. So taking it from the top, if we start from the sources, many of these sources to this committee will be familiar. But there are a couple of zigs and zags that I'd like to point out as we go through. So we start with the Emergency Board current law revenue forecast. You heard the latest update last Wednesday, not quite a week ago. And that is the 2.403 billion that you see at the top. We begin with that. And as has been kind of a traditional source, we also have some additional revenue from the property transfer tax. And this year, it's a little different. This year, there is, in fact, additional revenue from the property transfer tax, but that is from kind of session law sources or traditional sources. And by that, what I mean is the property transfer tax has a formula that we go through. It begins with the estimate of property transfer tax revenue. They take $2.5 million off the top to service an outstanding housing bond. They take 1.5% off the top to service or to pay for our current use program. And then what's left, which is, let's just say 95% of that, that is divided 33% to the general fund, 50% to the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, 13% to the municipal and regional planning commissions. Those percentages actually were changed slightly. The general fund now gets 37%. I think VHCB still gets 50%. Anyway, VHCB will get their full allotment this year. That's different. Typically, we've given them a flat appropriation and swept the rest into the general fund. That is different from past years. This year, they get their full allotment, as you heard in the speech. There are a few sources of revenue that we're sweeping into the general fund. The first one is the 1.5% that goes to the tax department, property evaluation and review, PB&R, to administer the current use program. Every year we reach out to them and we say, what's your budget? What do you need? And this year it came in at something like 590,000, just under 600,000. So 1.5% of the $80,600,000 of property transfer tax is quite a bit more than they need. It comes out to over $1 million. So what we do is we just net what their budget is against the million, and we sweep the remainder into the general fund. That comes out to be about $500,000, a little bit less. The other $2.5 million of this $3 million additional property transfer tax comes from what's often in session law to pay for the housing bond we have out there. They reduced the HCB's appropriation by $1.5 million. And they also take the clean water surcharge, $1 million of that. They sweep that into the general fund too. That you will see in our language, but that's typically been session law language. So that's the extra $2.5 million. When you add that to the small amount we take from the current use program that is not needed by tax, and that's where you get the additional $3 million. So you'll see language in D100 that makes that happen, but kind of the headline that I'd like to make sure you go away with is, this year, unlike past years, VHCB is getting their full 50% allotment, minus the $1.5 million that goes towards a housing service payment. Are there questions on that?
What is that amount?
Sorry?
What is that amount, the VHCB?
36.9 million or something like that, just under 37 million. But I think you have to net out the 1.5 million from that.
Yeah.
So let's say 35.6 or 7.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner, the additional property transfer tax that we had last year on non-resident buyers or second homeowners, that's not included in here, is it? I mean, isn't that automatically put for that natural resources board or help me out here?
No, I think that's included in, that's
included in the.
That is. The surcharge on second, yes, it is. That's, I would argue, one of the, if not the primary reason why you saw quite a steep increase projected for property transfer tax. Whether or not that's paid, I think, is open to question, but that was the forecast.
My recollection, Representative Harrison, from analyzing the bill last year, is that the Land Use Review Board was adding significant general fund pressure. It was now being funded more general fund than Act 250 permit fund. And so the PTT, that additional PTT increase would result in more flowing to the general fund through the mechanism the commissioner just described. So it's not carved out and going uniquely into a special fund, but I believe the projections and going through, the work behind that bill, I think that's how that was envisioned to fund. So it's so we're putting additional cost on the general fund with the LURB, but then we're sending more revenue to the general fund through this other mechanism that was projected to do so through that percentage form.
And it's part of the e-board forecast. I mean,
it's in that, it's in the top line number. It's embedded in there, forecast by the economists.
Yeah. So when you add little over $3 million to, the E-Board, you come out with slightly more than what the E-Board forecast says. To that, we add what are traditional direct applications, reversions, and transfers. Again, what you see on this list, I think, will be familiar to you in terms of sources. There is one or two that I'd like to spend a little bit, or at least make sure that you're aware of. Lower this year relative to past years is liquor control. You'll recall that in the BAA, we had a general fund transfer into the liquor control fund to clear up a deficit. And our statement then was, you may anticipate in future years that we're going to budget for what we anticipate to be available net revenue. And so this 14 million in past budgets has been in the 20 to $21 million range. So going forward from liquor, they're anticipating that they can make a $14 to $15 million, $14.8 million direct transfer into.
Essentially, we were kidding ourselves when we were taking 21, 22 million. We didn't really have.
You could say that. I mean, we weren't, I mean, honestly, Jim, it was an honest kid by that. I mean, this traditionally was what we generated.
Right.
Net revenue, but it has gone down. There have been some market forces, and
This is the realistic.
so it's a realistic number according to liquor.
Thank you.
So I did want to point out that's a little bit lower. On the other hand, unclaimed property is, sorry, there's a question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Was there a question?
Okay, but question.
Yeah, well, the question was,
Oh, I'm sorry.
with the floods and the pandemic and everything, we probably lost quite a few restaurants and bars. Is that, has anybody looked into that? Is that primary cause, or people just simply?
That was part of it. Actually, a number of outlets closed. And I think that hindered them, but we spoke to the commissioner about that, and she thought that was more of a short-term force. I think the market forces, big picture, are more important. So again, kind of going in the other direction, unclaimed property is a bit larger than typically it has been over the years. And, this seems to be the gift that keeps on giving in terms of revenue. Receipts from unclaimed property have gone up substantially over the past few years. This is closer to, we believe, a realistic amount. If I were a betting man, I'd say that probably will go up during the session as they see more revenue come in. You see the estimate there from sports wagering. There's a small reversion from the legislature that I think they're using a current, which is a little bit unusual. They're saying that they're going to revert money at the end of this fiscal 26, which will partly offset some of their budgetary pressures. I would also note that this year, again, there is no revenue or no direct app from the Secretary of State. That used to be an annual affair. That is, for the past few years, they've had various expenses that have redirected money that otherwise would have been swept into the general fund.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, Representative Stevens.
In that same category, Commissioner, can you explain Attorney General settlements? You only have $2 million here. Can you give me an idea of how it works when we see in the news that the Attorney General's office settles for $66 million or something? Where does that money go, and how does it get spent?
So every year we reach out to the AG's office, and typically it's this year I think it was Sarah London. They give us a guesstimate. They typically guess low because they don't know. So they make an estimate, and those settlements, I mean, the one thing to keep in mind on those settlements is they're often not immediate. They're over a course of 10 years or so. So the revenue is spread out. So it wouldn't come in any one year, but this would be the main fund where settlement money.
And that can be used,
That,
so that department, the AG's office, when they get a settlement, it's just general fund dollars.
some of it is used to offset their
Or special.
expenses. Yeah.
Tobacco, et cetera.
Yeah, a lot of the big ones are flowing into special funds and not the general funds. So I'm thinking of tobacco and opioid settlement funds, for instance. So we don't see those on the general fund operating statement because there are other funds that are capturing that revenue.
Like, if I may, the setup of the safe injection site that was passed last year, I believe those funds are coming from the opioid settlement fund, which was the one that was in the news this past week. And other treatment programs, but we get guidance, I guess, from Human Services on, and there's an advisory committee set up on where those funds should be spent. So,
Over the past few years, there's been roughly $1 million to $2 million of additional revenue that's come in that we've received in budget adjustment and so on when their settlement revenue is higher than they thought. Not just special funds and opioid settlement, but just direct to the state. So generally, they can bring in more through settlement, but it's not always the case. And $2 million for the past few years has been what they've offered us as here's a good plug. So.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So against the total sources, which are the e-board forecast, a little bit of extra property transfer tax, and direct apps, reversions, and other transfers, you come to 2.509 billion. It's against that sum that we subtract a number of governor's revenue initiatives. And I think he touched on all of these during the speech. And I know that, your Ways and Means Committee will go over these, but really quickly, the Downtown and Village Center tax credit, some of you may be familiar with this. There's a $3 million cap on those credits. Over the past couple of years, I think we put some one-time money towards increasing that cap up to $5 million. This year, what we're asking for is to make it permanent. So make the cap permanently at $5 million. There's a call to expand the child tax credit by 1 year. That's the $1,000 tax credit that phases out as your income goes up, but it's for lower and income people, it's $1,000 per child, but that is for children up to age 5. So we're asking now for children up to age 6. The childless EITC, that's a component of the earned income tax credit. It's for adults without children. That is actually a relatively small component of those who are eligible for the earned income tax credit. And here we're asking to expand from 38% of the federal credit all the way up to 100% of the federal credit. So the Social Security exemption, I think that will be familiar to, I know, a number of members of this committee. We're just trying to bump up the threshold by small amounts over time. This would take the $50,000 single filer threshold and move it up to 55. It would take the $65,000 joint filer threshold and move it up to 70. So in both cases, we're moving it up $5,000. It's a small step in the right direction. And then finally, I think one budget that the governor has issued over his 8 years has not included a call to remove military pension income tax. I think he's called for that every year except one. And he's back calling for that again. This is, we think just a terrific way to attract military retirement families to live in Vermont, many of whom come here mid-career, who offer us skills and talent. So it is featured again in his budget. The entire package of tax credits and reductions in taxes for certain filers comes out to $15.5 million. So in terms of, once we get through that, our total base revenue that we are bringing to bear in base appropriations and transfers is $2.493 million. And then finally, we add to that some one-time revenue that is predominantly from three sources. One from the BAA, that you remember when we were here before, the governor had wanted to not invest all of the available revenue in the budget adjustment. He wanted some of it to drop to the bottom line, to reserve and carry forward. That was it. That's part of what you see here, $68 million of it. There is also the rest of this is virtually all due to the fact that we have a revenue upgrade from the emergency board for fiscal 25 revenue that will carry into fiscal 26. And notably, some additional property transfer tax revenue that came in when they boosted the property transfer tax forecast estimate.
If I could, I just want to understand the breakdown. You said 68 million
68 million
is money, assuming we adopt the BAA, similar to what you proposed, that would still be left there. And then 49 million from the upgrade.
broadly, yeah.
Last week. What else is in there?
That's it.
Okay.
Was there another figure for the PTT, did you say?
Yeah, I mean, but that came from the e-board upgrade. In other words,
Right, so they both-
so they both, I mean, together they account for the remainder of the amount.
You put it all as one time, and I get the surplus, that we might be carrying right now, but the revenue upgrade, some of that gets baked into the base going
Yes.
forward.
This is just from FY 25. Additional revenue
Okay.
that was not baked into Act 113 and was not in the July e-board forecast either. So
So what they projected in fiscal year 26 for total revenue, you're using that.
that's in the top line. That's in the top line number 2.403.
Yep, that's in the base. Anything from prior year is always considered one time.
Thank you.
So the total amount thus that we bring to bear is the 2.493 of base revenue and 131.3 of one-time revenue for a total of 2.625 of total revenue. And it is that sum that we will now address as to how we intend to deploy it.
Any questions so far? Thank you.
Okay,
So I'm going to take a rest here.
okay, thank you, Commissioner. I will take my glasses off, actually, attempt to read this
Size 6 font.
print that's in front of me. We saved money on downsizing the font this year, so, yeah. So starting at the top,
We're all older.
I represent that. So starting at the top of the uses section on page 15, the way we lay this out is beginning with what we call the base appropriation starting point, which is based on FY 25 appropriations. So we start by laying out what the FY 25 starting point was, and then we're going to describe all the changes, increases or decreases to that starting point, and we're going to come up with what we call a current services total. Now, there's more detail behind the current services a few pages earlier, between pages 8 and page 10, if you want to see what the current services budget looks like broken down by department. Here, we're just looking at the big picture statewide on this sheet that I'll walk you through. So starting at the very top, we've got the 2.112 million number, and that represents the total base appropriations, which means all appropriations in sections B100 through B1000 of 2024 Act 113, which is the FY 24 big bill. So we started out when we left the session last year with that 2.112 of base appropriations. Now, when we put together a current services budget, we typically add to that a one-time appropriation that is kind of like a base cost as well, which is the Pay Act appropriation, which in Act 113 was the $30.6 million number that we're also going to add in the calculation of base appropriation starting point. There are two smaller adjustments that are a little bit unusual, but should be added into the base starting point for comparison purposes as well. There is a $250,000 adjustment that I'll try to explain as briefly as I can and still make it understandable. It's a little bit of an unusual situation. In the FY 23 big bill, I believe it was, established an Office of Health Equity, and for lack of a better place at the time to put the funding, since a permanent location for the office would not be determined until sometime, hopefully during the subsequent fiscal year, based on a recommendation of the Health Equity Advisory Commission and so on and so forth. $250,000 was put into the Agency of Administration Secretary's office base appropriation to hire positions if they were able to do so. And this is actually the 2024 big bill. I may have said 2023. It was the big bill that was enacted in 23, but funding for FY 24. At the end of FY 2024, the funds had not been expended by the Secretary of Administration and still remained. In the FY 2025 budget, if you look at that, in the current fiscal year for Agency of Administration, the Secretary's office actually did a reduction of $250,000 because the Equity Office was not going to live in the Agency of Administration Secretary's office. So they took it down. But in FY 25, what probably should have happened was VDH should have done an increase correspondingly of $250,000, but they did not. And so because they did not make that increase in the same year, and now in the 26 budget, we want to put those funds into VDH's budget. We're adding $250,000 to the base starting point because it should have been in the FY 25 budget, but it wasn't. If that makes sense. And if it doesn't, I'm happy to follow up outside of this meeting to more clearly explain. Clear as mud. The next item, which is a larger amount of $5,000, is another item that I would describe as,
5 million?
yeah,
You said 5,000.
I'm sorry,
Those decimal points are getting.
5,000, exactly. Sorry. So the 5 million was an amount that was actually taken out of the DOC, the corrections base, in FY 25. And in Act 113, Section B 1104, the legislature directed us directed the state to replace that funding in any base from which that was reduced to be replaced with ARPA funds, that in the 26 budget, it should be replaced in the general fund. There was only one instance of that happening in the budget. It's this one where there was this $5,000 swap of ARPA into DOC. $5 million again, I'm sorry. Can you tell it was a late night? Tying up all the budget details, so I apologize to the committee. So that's that $5,000 add back. And then we're making another 12 million, not thousand, adjustment or add back, which is based on the VSER's pension plus payment, which normally would be funded in section B104.1 and would appear in that base appropriations starting point top line in B100 through B1000. But you may recall the House actually did fund this. Initially, the governor proposed funding it out of carry forward. The House said, no, we're going to put this back in the base budget. Ultimately, in the final version of the bill, it ended up getting taken out of the base and funded, surprisingly to me, by contingency funding. So based on additional receipts coming in at the end of the year, funded that pension plus appropriation. But since it did not appear in the base, but it should, to make an apples to apples comparison of current service budget, I am showing this on this worksheet as an add back to the base. So what that does is get us to what we call the base appropriation starting point of the $2.160 million, $2.16 billion. Any questions on how we got to this starting point? If not, I'll move on to the more interesting part, which is the current service changes. The first line is what we are seeing when we analyze the budget and the account code for salaries and wages across all agencies and departments statewide for the general fund. We're seeing a $43.3 million increase in salaries and wages. And this is a fairly remarkable number. This is actually a little more than twice the figure that I showed on this overview statement last year to this committee at this time. I guess there are a few factors that contribute to the magnitude of this increase. One is simply the annual COLA increase of the collective bargaining agreement being higher, perhaps the highest we've ever seen. So there's the percentage increase that automatically, that's obviously going to be a driver. There are also embedded within this number a number of other unusual factors that are reflected in the budget this year. There is, for instance, in the category of pay called shift differential, there's over $11 million of increase year over year due to different ways of scheduling and funding employees that are most of that being related to the Department of Corrections. There's an outsized increase there, and there are also some outsized increases outside of the basic statewide collective bargaining agreement. There are, this budget reflects a number of class-wide RFRs, if you're familiar with that term, request for reclassification. So that is a process by which, it can be brought by management or by union, but saying this class of employee should be compensated at a higher rate based on making various arguments and comparative analysis. Number of changes there that affect some large employee groups statewide, primarily related to the law enforcement job positions. So these are details that you will see more clearly as you go through department by department, individual department budgets. But the net impact we're seeing statewide appears to be over $40 million for the general fund. The next number is also a fairly extraordinary increase. This is just the employer contribution associated with health benefits costs. The employer contribution, which is 80% of the premium costs that are assessed by a payroll to all employees participating in the state health program. And again, this is general fund impact only. So probably something more than twice this, the statewide impact, but this is a $19.8 million increase to the general fund. The next line is also outsized this year, the increase in retirement. Sure.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, please.
Health insurance,
Yes.
that's the increase. Is that, you had alluded, I think, a couple weeks ago that it was a 15% increase in
That's right.
premium.
Yep.
So does that represent just the 15%?
That represents 15, well, that represents the 15, we had a 15%, it's on calendar year
Yeah.
for the premium. So we just,
Oh,
my paycheck just got hit with a 15% increase
okay.
a couple of weeks ago in what I pay. And so did the state side. I pay 20%, the state pays 80%.
Right.
of that health plan cost. That rate, Jim, that was 15% over what I was paying in December, right? That rate will continue through Jan 1 of 2026. And then on Jan 1 of 2026, there will be another increase.
You have to estimate something to put in here, right?
And that's baked in. It is a single digit as opposed to a double digit increase because you'll recall in the EAA presentation, the 18.5 million. So another way of looking at this, and we were primarily thinking more of the employee impact in mitigating that, but this $19.455 million number would be quite a bit higher if we did not make the 18.5 million transfer. And off the top of my head, doing some fund splits in my head, I would say it would be around 7 million higher than this number if we were not doing the general fund transfer.
And I appreciate it. We're going to talk a little bit more of that with human resources tomorrow, I think.
Yeah.
Obviously, I think me, but.
Oh, Adam. You.
But 7.5 million, it's not 18.5 either. So, but I understand where you.
Right. And that's because of the fund splits and the general fund only. And
We'll learn more tomorrow.
But keep in mind, this represents the delta over last year.
I know.
Right,
I know.
so-
It's not a big number.
January 1,
Yeah.
but from last year's budget.
fiscal year,
What's the total amount the state spends on healthcare
A lot.
premiums?
we'll talk about that tomorrow.
Yeah, well, we'll give you the,
That's a question that we have.
But he's not-
And we'll ask tomorrow.
yeah, a couple hundred million. We'll give you the.
Employee increase in personnel, is that wrapped in, any of that, and is it wrapped into there? If so, what proportion? More staff.
Are you talking about the, which line are you
Through
talking?
those lines.
All three of those lines. Are you saying increase in headcount? To the extent that there is any increase in headcount, that would be incorporated in these numbers. I don't believe we are seeing much, if any, increase in headcount when we get into those details in the FY26 budget. Yep. So it's really driven by our existing level, but
Inflation.
increasing costs, it's inflationary costs with our current staff level. And actually, I should add, to the extent that there are any increases, Representative LaRoche, they would not be seen here in where I'm representing the current services changes. So here I'm trying to show the costs of doing things exactly as we are now in next year's budget. So if we're adding staff for some initiative, that should be reflected in the lines down below that Adam will discuss, which are policy related changes outside of the current services, as the governor said, keeping the lights on. What I'm talking about here in going through this first table are where the costs are increasing in that 133 million to just do things the same way.
So strictly inflationary costs. Yeah, thanks.
An excellent question, though. And I think actually, before I move off from the retirement employer contribution, I briefly recap when I first addressed this committee with a budget presentation, I think 4 years ago, our retirement contribution rate, the employer contribution was 21.4%. Because I remember being shocked at how high that was when I came aboard the state, that you've got to pay 21% on every dollar of payroll. Wow, right? It is now 28.8%. We had kept it at 26.7, and we were able to hold that for a few years, I think in part because we had some expansion in terms of headcount. So that maybe lets you keep the same rate and have more dollars into the system. We had to do an increase this year, a mid-year increase for the first time since I've been on board with the state, because we get the actuary's projection in the fall. They say what the ADEC, the actuarially defined employer contribution, should be. And we're essentially required, by law to set this contribution rate at a level that will meet that. And then on top of that are the pension plus payments, we'll see in a minute, which are supposed to be all in addition. Those $12 million, $15 million payments are supposed to be over and above the basic ADEC. So we're really forced to follow the law, raise that contribution rate to the 28.8 this year. And that's really what is driving, that's completely, we moved from 26.7% of payroll to 28.8, and that costs $19.5 million. So that's where that number came from. It's by following the formula. So the next line is other employee benefits. And, you know, about half of that is actually FICA. So federal wage burden, and that's just related to that huge number in salaries and wages increase up top. You're going to see that trickle through into the FICA as well. And there's also a material increase in the child care contribution is over $500,000, and some other pieces in there as well, sifting out to that $7.8 million increase. And that does it for all our like salary and benefit related items. If you total those numbers I just ran through, that's $90 million. So 90 million of this, the $133 million figure cited by the governor, 90 million of that is related to salaries and benefits. So that's obviously bulk of it. So I wanted to convey that as a takeaway. The next items are all the non-salary and benefit related cost pressures that are making up that current services increase. And these are just ordered kind of in the generally in order of how these functions appear in the budget. We've got increase in property tax assistance of $1.2 million. The next two lines are the increases in the pension plus payments for both the state retirement system and for the state teachers retirement systems. So those pension plus payments were $12 million each in FY25, escalating up to the $15 million. So those each have $3,000 increases. There is a large increase in our annual contribution to the teachers retirement system in section B514. That's about $5.2 million. And we've got a significant increase in retired teachers' health care, section B515 of $6 million as well. I'll take a pause there in case there are any questions. So if seeing no questions, we move on to the next two lines, which are the material offsets that are actually decreases in general fund budget. Both of those items related to the Child Care Financial Assistance Program. One of those being purely a caseload forecast related adjustment, which is the $3.5 million down, and the other item being really what you could describe as, I guess, the revenue upgrade provided by the January 25 e-board meeting that just took place. So based on their forecast of revenue from the child care contribution tax to the special fund for Child Care Financial Assistance Program, that upgrade of $19 million means that we can shift costs from the $50 million general fund appropriation for that amount into the special fund and free up that amount of general fund to help offset other pressures. A major one among them being the next line on this sheet, which is the increase in global commitment general fund match for federal funds. So this is really the state share of Medicaid, and that's an over $30 million figure. So that's for, and that's in section B301, the Secretary's Office global commitment that covers match for, across all departments within AHS, a lot of that being obviously DEVA.
So that's going up 30 million because we have new investments, things are costing more, where?
Sure, that's just, I guess the easiest way to describe it would be, let's look at what's happening with our health plan that we just talked about and the costs there and the pressure there. I think that's being mirrored in cost pressures being faced by private employers with their plans in the market, and then Medicaid is seeing the same trends of costing more, essentially same population and higher costs.
But we don't, are you looking at caseload and utilization as well, or?
I think what you'll find is this is utilization. Caseloads are pretty stable.
Okay,
And, they've kind of ended redeterminations, I believe, are over, stabilized the population. But, to Hardy's point, I mean, it's just costing more to service the same people. For the same reason, it's costing more for us to ensure our own population.
Dr. Bowman?
Yes. Is this where, or can you tell me, are there any budget increases for programs like Choices for Care or developmental services, cost of living increases for those caregivers? Would they be here?
If they're current services programs, they are in that number.
So
Yes.
some being granted this year, or would you know?
What do you mean, some being granted?
Are they getting a cost of living increase? Do you know, or would that,
Mean for providers and so on?
for the people they hire for the caregivers to do the work?
There are no cost of living increases in the current service. But also, to answer your question, not in the
Okay,
initiatives.
thank you.
Dr. Dickinson?
Yeah, there was a thing yesterday about the fact that we're going to be able to use our waiver to pay for housing costs with Medicaid. Is that included?
No. That would be in the initiative section down below. So if we're not currently doing it,
It's not there.
it's not there. So in some of our governor's initiatives lines, we'll identify amounts that are GF match required for new Medicaid initiatives.
That would be there. Okay,
But these are the current services only. Yeah.
great, currencies. Good, thank you.
So, rounding out the list of increases, the next line is 4.15 million increases related to the higher education sections of the budget. And this $11.8 million is really just a catch-all to keep this sheet from to make this one line instead of 100 lines in this summary. This is just everything else. It's the net of everything else up and down in the current services framework.
ES, service levels of agreement, things like that, too, or is that?
Actually, they are primarily, yes, they would be in that line. The ADS allocations would be up further in internal service fund allocations of 2.8 million.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I forgot to speak to that line specifically, I think, as I was moving through. But the internal service fund allocations include the ADS allocation, the financial management charge for the financial and HR systems, fee for space, the insurance programs for liability and workers' comp. Those are all in that line up there. But I think you're right. Service level agreements would not be picked up in that 2.8, and they would be part of the 11.8. Yep. And the final is a down, which is just the decrease in the Pay Act appropriation that was provided in Act 113, the Pay Act section. So it went from 30 million general fund down to about 27 million, just based on the percentage increase in the COLA decreasing. There was a larger increase the first year than the second year. So that takes us down to,
Kosenska has the question and then.
oh, sure.
Just real quick, and this is going to come up later here, but increases in higher education, is that just year increase with personnel, benefits, compensation kinds of things?
Well, if you turn to page 9, you can see the amounts per institution. I think we granted, for instance, UVM, I think it's a 3%, we gave 3% increases. So that was the budget, target issued in budget instructions. So really UVM gets 3%, Vermont State Colleges gets 3%. VSAC gets 3%, and VSAC was, slightly higher. I can't remember why, but really that was just, okay, we give you an appropriation each year and we're permitting 3% in accordance with the budget guidelines. Yep.
Great, thank you.
Okay. So that takes us, that really accounts for that total $133 million up.
Just one quick question.
Sure.
On the decrease in pay act,
Mhm.
why wouldn't you just take that off of the increase in salaries and wages line up above? I mean, isn't it all the same?
Sure, it's all a matter of how we present this. I'm trying to show this as uniquely, I'm tying this out to the budget document. So Pay Act is its own appropriation, and it was $30 million up above, and it's $27 million in this budget, but it's a unique one-time appropriations as opposed to being baked into the base. And that's why I thought it should be shown separately. But you're right. Yeah, that's out, theoretically.
I just didn't know. I mean, you have Pay Act and then you have the reallocation to different funds. It doesn't sound like enough for a reallocation. That's all. All the federal funds or whatever else a person's wages would be attributable to. Maybe I'm wrong. Okay, that's fine. I'll talk if I have more questions.
I guess what I wanted to show is that the three branches received 30 million in FY25 current year to apply towards the collective bargaining agreement pressures. And then that 30 million is essentially baked into the 43 million. So we're, the increases that take place in FY25 then become part of the base. So they're part of that big salaries and wages base increase in FY26.
So it's 73 million over 2 years, give or take.
That's
You had 30 million
the way that
this current year,
it's
and you're adding another 43 less 2.8.
well, it's no, not exactly. The challenge in conveying it, first in understanding and then communicating and conveying how we budget wages is when we budget wages in FY26, we're actually budgeting them based on current pay, what people are currently getting paid right now. We're not budgeting it based on what they will be getting paid next year. And the reason for that is when the budget is put together, we typically don't know what the pay will be because the collective bargaining negotiations are taking place, and then they hit like late in the session. Then there's the Pay Act thing is added, and that's why we don't budget what they'll actually be. We budget what they are right now, and then this amount is added called Pay Act to add on top. So it's almost like it's a year behind, like it's almost like the wage salaries budget is like a year behind. So you're never going to have enough in your regular salary budget to pay what the actual wages are, whatever they turn out to be. That's why there's this other Pay Act amount to then make up the difference in that year. And that's also why I like to show the Pay Act appropriation amounts and the salary amounts separately. I'm not sure if that makes it more understandable or not. I'd be happy to give a short talk on Pay Act sometime and do a walkthrough if this still sounds like gobbledygook for anyone. It took me a while to get my head around it after coming aboard, I'll tell you that.
It's here, it's the 43 million will actually will show up in the individual department budgets because it's the second year.
That's right, yes.
As opposed to last year where they didn't know what the Pay Act was going to be until the end, and that's why we added a lump sum.
And so it's also accurate, I think, to say that yes, the 30 million of Pay Act in FY25 is now part of that $43 million increase, and then the other parts are those other things I talked about, like shift differentials and RFRs, kind of making up the difference.
Kind of the first thing you do when you start a budget for a year is you annualize the prior year's payout. That's kind of the first step.
I'm just looking at.
I know, I get it.
2 years, it's a big number, and probably a lot of it is driven by corrections and the high COLA and, you know, with the inflationary environment we're in.
Well, that's why, yeah, there are some, I tried to mention some of the extraordinary factors that make the salary and benefits pressure higher than 30 million. Like ideally, if there was nothing but the collective bargaining agreement, the base pay act agreement, you would see it should look just like that 30 million pay act appropriation in FY 25. You'd see that as your increase, but it's actually more because there is other stuff as well.
Rep. Lula has a question.
Yeah, I am wondering, I'm just trying to get the global view here. The budget adjustment there are a number of commitments that we are being asked to make that basically fill holes. I mean, it's the long-term resident, the residential care, nursing homes, the $10 million, at DIVA, all the global commitment, and I'm just wondering, does this budget help us avoid that in the coming year?
We hope so. Is the answer. We hope so, but we don't know. I mean, the costs are, sometimes they escalate faster than we think, and other times they don't escalate as much as we think they might. But I think the honest answer is we hope so.
The Medicaid reimbursement rate for designated agencies, et cetera, am I understanding that is not changing? That is not a proposal?
Sorry.
The reimbursement rate for agencies that serve those on Medicaid, that is not changing in this budget?
And that was a consideration for us. Keep in mind, in fiscal 23, they received an 8% bump. In fiscal 24, they received a 5% bump, both of which were higher than inflation. Last year at 3%. So, pardon me? Oh. So we looked at it this year, and with the pressures that we had brought amongst our own government, payments and current services, we elected not to increase that again, but that was a subjective choice we made.
It would be helpful when we're in the context of talking about the pressures on particularly AHS departments to understand how much of what we are seeing the BAA is related to those Medicaid reimbursement rates. How much of those, those holes, I certainly hear about them a lot from providers in my area, and the difficulties that they face. So I just, that would be helpful, and I'm just putting it out on the table for us to consider.
Okay.
So that, I guess, concludes the review of the current services 6% increase of $133 million. If there are no further questions on the current services piece, I'll turn it over to Commissioner Gresham for the initiatives, which is usually the more fun and exciting part of the budget. So
let's see about that. So the initiatives, on the one hand, I'd like to say that there's, I guess if you include the revenue initiatives, about $50 million of base initiatives in this budget. The revenue initiatives we dealt with up top, that's foregone revenue, but we intend for them to be part of our base. So we consider that to be a base initiative. By that, I mean, we tend to be ongoing revenue initiative. And then about 34 million of new base expenditures that were not part of last year's budget. However, it's a little bit misleading in one particular aspect. As you look down the list, you may notice a little more than halfway down the largest expenditure, the 20.25 million. And for those who have been at this a while, you'll recall that there's typically a $20 million transfer from the T fund to the general fund, ostensibly to pay for the state police. And years ago, that was actually quite a bit higher. I think you heard in the speech today, the governor described, I think it was $48 million at some point. And that's ratcheted down over the years. And, you know, that is a bit of a holdover from the days when the T fund was flush and the general fund wasn't. And so this year, we've been thinking in this mindset for a number of years, but this year we thought we would, marshal, save the resources and put them together. And so to have the general fund assume what, normally historically has been a general fund expenditure. So it's an up in general fund expenditure, but it's a down in T fund expenditure, or it removes the pressure for the transportation fund to fund a component of state police that, again, historically used to be funded by the general fund. So across the state, it's net neutral, but it is a general fund up. So that's, by far the largest single base expenditure that you see. Second to that are a number of ACCD housing initiatives. One, and both of these are not new initiatives. I think you'll be familiar with BHIP and what we call MER, Manufactured Housing Improvement or Home Improvement and Repair Program. Both of those are ongoing programs. Both of them have been funded with one-time dollars. And here in this budget, we're asking to bring those in-house. To bring them in-house, to make them base expenditures, because they are programs that have withstood the test of time. They're not replacing some of the work, for example, that VHCB does. They're adding to the work, or they're looking at a different sector of that work. Again, I think you heard the governor speak about that in his speech. And then finally, we're also asking to make the International Business Development Office that we've had in Quebec over the past few years, that too ACCD is very happy with. We think they've been a great asset to have and to keep Vermont's word going on in Canada. So we'd like to also make that a base expenditure.
Commissioners, obviously, as you mentioned, the biggest change here is the transfer back to general fund of transportation expenses. What happens to the transportation budget if we don't do that or don't do all of that? I mean, there's no shortage of ways this committee and others in the building may want to spend that $20 million. And I appreciate the sensitivity and pressure. I, for one, might want to do more on the Social Security tax relief or other areas, but there aren't going to be pressures. What happens if we don't do it? The transportation budget sort of like that in another committee, and we kind of get it at the end, and it's like, oh, here it is. And but those decisions kind of need to be made together in some respect.
So when they submitted their budget, they first submitted a budget because they had heard that we were considering this, and they submitted a budget, I think, that included the elimination of this expenditure. And we asked them to submit a budget that did not include that. And I think the large majority would be postponing projects. I mean, that's basically their.
That's what I mean, and I recognize they've had cost pressures too. You know, a lot of things, I'm sure, in their world have gone up. And, you know, gas tax revenues aren't, you know, going up like they used to at one point. If anything, they're going down. I get all that. I'm just, what if, you know, type thing.
I think maybe an easy way to answer that, Jim, is that those current services pressures that I just walked through with the salaries and benefits, they may have in fact the largest group of employees in state government, but they're all paid from the T fund. So they're seeing the same pressures. So it really, I think they may not be able to present, as we're doing here, a current services budget with available revenue. It would actually be less than current services. If they kept all their staff on, there would be a lot less project work.
Yeah, and
Or
yeah,
there
no
would
one's
be,
discussing that, especially with things like today where you got a couple inches of snow and the conditions are extraordinarily slippery and, you know, we want those trucks out there doing what they do, so. Okay, just hypothetical, I'm asking.
and I think I think you could assess pretty quickly that based on seeing the same kind of percentage increases in salaries and benefits, those would still far exceed the $20 million shift that we're talking about.
Thank you.
Looking through some of the other initiatives, and obviously the agencies and departments of jurisdiction will come in and speak to you more eloquently than I, but you'll note there are a number of initiatives for vulnerable populations here. I would point out the VDH Recovery Campus, setting up another recovery campus, as well as staffing up to deal with these populations for asking for aftercare positions.
For that?
I'm sorry?
Is there a location for that?
They haven't chosen one yet, but they are investigating. So, and I want to say it's in the Northeast Kingdom. Again, as well as staffing up to manage in what we're calling a continuum of care environment. So that, again, I think BDH will be happy to speak to you on that. In addition, you know, as the governor mentioned in his speech, you know, for DCFOEO, there's been both an expansion, additional shelter bed capacity, as well as a commitment to operate for operational costs for the additional shelters that are open. So we're looking both to expand our capacity as well as, you know, provide the resources to operate what is open. The only other thing I would point out here is you'll note here too, the Green Mountain Care Board. There are some new positions there, and that's to help them kind of both analyze and regulate the new kind of ahead model that we're moving towards in a year's time. You'll notice in this budget, in the one-time section, there's some money to bridge the time period from the time the ACO ends, which is the end of this calendar year, and 2027, when we enter into this new global payment model called AHEAD. There's some bridge funding for primary care providers that are currently benefiting from the payments from the ACO. So there's a fair amount of planning going on in this budget. In addition, there has been, you know, a request from Green Mountain Care Board for additional resources so they can build their staff, so they can be proper analyzers and regulators of healthcare.
That's not nearly what I heard they need.
Well, what they asked for, I happened to sit next to the chair of the Green Mountain Care Board, and he was very pleased with what he
Is this
received.
$300,000?
Well, that's 300,000 general fund. They also have other funding sources through Bill Back. So that may be, in fact, more positions. But the fact is, we, in our budget, had thought of 3 positions.
And could you back up and tell me, because I've never seen this come through here, and maybe it happens and I just keep missing it, confined animal feeding, AFO permitting transition.
Well, it's something new, so that's why you're seeing
That's why I
it
haven't
for
seen it
this time.
before, right?
And so the permitting associated with confined animal feeding, I believe the agency of jurisdiction was ag
Oh, and that's. what you were
previously,
told they
and
had
it's
switched.
it's transitioning to DEC. So there are within that, there's the cost of 2 positions as the base cost. And then the $850,000 one time involves a database program anyway, and some other startup costs. So I can't provide more detail other than that high level, but it's the transition
From one agency to another.
from one agency to another that's
Pretty expensive. Yeah. And
Okay, thank you. I kind of want to go back to the Green Mountain Care Board. My understanding, what I read was that they were asking for 5 positions for the next year, and then there was a total of 20 over the next few years because of this new program. You look like you're putting them in for 3. What was the difference between the 3 and the 5?
The difference was a healthy dialogue with the Mountain Care Board, where we spent a lot of numbers we thought would move the ball forward. And we ended up with 3.
Because I've seen this in other offices.
Yeah.
They're really used to just 4 and they ask for 6 and then.
I'll also tell you, though, that, I mean, again, we had a really healthy conversation and, you know, he acknowledged that it's not that easy to hire these people. It's hard to find
Yes.
the right people. So, you know, I don't want to speak for them. I mean, I know that you guys will
We
be.
hope to hire people that are good, that can do the job, and the number 3 is, okay.
So I mean, I don't want to speak for them. I'm sure that they could use all the resources we can provide.
Okay, thank you.
There are, sorry, is there other questions?
I have a question, but it's tangential maybe, but I mean, layered through everything, I mean, the problem we have in the state, costing us money in every category you can think of, from police services to prison services to health services to housing services, and on and on and on. It's draining us. I mean, is there any effort within, and what agency would be doing it to try to assess what the magnitude or put a dollar value on how much this is costing us and how much we should invest in stopping it?
That would be a question I'll follow up on. You're welcome. I thought I'd move on to some one-time policy changes. There, you'll notice on the following page, there is a list of our one-time investments that add up to about $100 million. Madam Chair, I don't know if this is the best time to go through each one of them. I'm happy to, if you'd like, but I did want to point those out, and maybe we finish going through the main body of this, we can move on to the one-time appropriations. But again, there's just under 100 million of them.
Or of the other.
Yeah.
Yeah, so as we go through the other ones, and probably it makes sense in the context of the larger
Okay.
each one's budget or whatever.
So you notice just below there, there's a $77 million transfer to the education fund. I think you heard the governor in his speech this afternoon. I think that pretty much says it all. I mean, what we're trying to do is stabilize property tax rates and, give some air, let's call it, to both property owners, property taxpayers, but also provide some air to the folks who are working on the transformation of education. So we are using some surplus general fund, which admittedly is an effort. This is a lot of money. I don't care how much surplus we have. This is a lot of money. And
Is your assumption that, everybody's property tax will not go up, or the average will be zero?
the latter,
The average.
the average
Everybody
statewide.
doesn't get a pony.
And there are some caveats that I think are important to mention.
There need to be some guardrails, I would think, because we had that problem last year, right? Where we put out something with a 5% cap and everybody said, oh, goody, I can do what I want and I'll get 5%.
Well, on that, we are very much messaging to school boards that we expect them to work with us, and we hope they will work with us. But the caveats I was going to mention is that the number you see here, the transfer to the education fund, is based on our estimates of the increase in education spending, which in turn were baked into the commissioner's December 1st letter. Since that time, we've had some new information, but school boards have, actually by now, school boards have either voted or are shortly going to vote their budgets.
Yeah,
But we don't have that information. In most years, the fact is we would know what spending will be because 99% of school budgets were in the affirmative. But last year, we saw that a very significant minority of them were not voted in the affirmative. So it's in this fluid environment where we're making our best efforts to guess what the correct amount of money will be to freeze average statewide property taxes. But we'll find out probably in a few weeks whether it would require more or maybe less. We don't know. But this was, the subject of a fair amount of both dialogue and analytical input to come up with this amount.
So the 77 is based on 5.9% anticipated increase from the December 1 letter.
That's correct.
I mean, and if it ends up being 2% or 3%, then that need would go down.
That's correct.
And we won't know those numbers really until April.
Well, we'll have a better idea when we can sift through the budgets that have been submitted for town meeting day vote. The Agency of Education usually at this point, will reach out and just get together basically a crude spreadsheet of, these budgets and what they're up and, it's not particularly hard work, but it's time consuming work. So, but yes, that's by April, we should know. It should be before town meeting, really.
well, except two of the biggest school districts don't vote on town meeting week.
That's true, but
Burlington and Essex Westford.
they tell us what's in there.
They have a sense of it, but they don't have the same urgency for knowing it by March 1st or whatever.
So, and when you say statewide, do you mean the state's contribution to the property tax rate, the state's property tax rate, or does that include the local contributions?
That includes the average rate that you and I and every other Vermonter, if we're a homeowner, will receive. Some of the rates will be a little higher because of your common level of appraisal or your CLA. Some of the rates will be a little lower because of your CLA or other local dynamics. But what I mean is, on an average statewide, they will balance out to be zero. That was the
I'm
intent.
just curious because it's, like speaking to the point that the chair made, there are some communities that saw 14.5% increase or 13.9, just like the average was. Of course, there are some that showed a decrease in some of the more rural communities. Some people saw an increase of 25% or 29%. So with that breadth of change, it indicates that local CLA, local needs, local education budgets are going to be different. How does this work to zero out any increase on everybody's?
It doesn't.
It doesn't.
It doesn't. It's average state, like I said, it's average statewide. So on average,
There will be no increase.
yeah. And, every education fund or education fund outlook we issue has an average statewide property tax. And, it should have at the bottom the caveat, your results may vary. Because they do. So it would be no different, but he's just saying on average.
It'll still go up.
Yeah.
Which is important, because just like
But some will
the
slow down.
increase, right, but the increase was used as an indicator how, except that didn't apply to every community.
Right.
And so this is the reverse of that. We don't want necessarily every community to think that they're not gonna see an increase when in fact they may.
It's,
I think it's safe to say it'd be less of an increase. At least.
I don't know, what if Ludlow that saw -2%, sees an increase of 10% because of reason? I just,
Right.
I'm
Well,
not
we
arguing,
have-
I'm not arguing the point. I'm just trying to understand
Right.
what we're saying here when we say we don't want to see an increase, an average increase.
And that's where it gets difficult. because
It simply reduces the amount that needs to be raised via the homestead property tax by that amount.
Yeah.
So this is only the homestead property tax. This is not the non-homestead property. tax.
Actually,
It's all property.
it's actually both.
It's not,
Yeah.
the second homeowners are going to get this deal too.
It's going to be statewide.
So, yeah,
Average, no,
It will
yes.
affect the homestead and
And
non-residential.
non-homestead.
And I think do we have that detail in the operating statement?
We
Maybe
do.
we don't need to go there now, but,
But we will want to go there at some point.
if I may,
Yes.
this amount that you're putting aside for one time, that's just for the fiscal year 26. You're
Yeah.
not banking any of this, figuring you might need some additional funds during the transition period next year.
It is for 1 year. It is for 1 year. And I think it's also important to note that that calculation took into account a number of factors. The first one was school spending, what that was. The second one was what the bottom line of the education fund had. There was, you saw in BAA, we dropped it. And the third one was, we are calling for the cancellation of what's called the universal meals and a reversion to the free and reduced program that we all had prior to universal meals. So we're looking to move to the same federal program that, those people who had kids in school back in the day used. So, sorry.
Good luck.
The government, this is in line with what the governor has called for a number of years. So,
No, they canceled the community high school. They can't do it anymore. We were just joking that every year you put 3 million for the community high school of Vermont, you transferred it, funded it, we took it out. And we just got rid of the community high school of Vermont, so. It's not in here this year. It's like the first year in 6, I haven't seen it.
dreadfully sorry about that. I know you guys enjoy.
We have fond memories of moving it out.
So that, just moving on, you can see that is a major one-time initiative. The other one I wanted to point out is there's two, in terms of transfers, there's two more. The bottom one is we're continuing the PCB testing and remediation. It's another 10 million.
Can we pause that? We paused that for a while.
I
I don't
think,
know why this is back. That's.
I don't think
My
it's paused.
understanding is that these are schools currently in process to complete testing and remediation efforts in schools that are currently,
So this isn't new testing, this is
It's not.
remediation of. old
my
testing.
understanding, and of course that you'll want to hear the details
Yeah.
more from the department, but my understanding is that this is not knocking on doors of new schools, but this is finishing what we started.
And this 952 is actually a $10 million minus a certain amount that pays part of the wages of someone who will help carry out this program.
Yes.
Okay, I don't want to prolong the conversation this afternoon, but can you give us any insight on the $15 million for billing change?
That was my next item. It's a good segue.
It's about this.
Well, I know, they said they were talking to you about needing to change, but $15 million just for a billing model change?
Well, it's,
We'll go in and do it.
It's cheaper.
2 million, right? We'll do
Might be
it.
cheaper.
It's a little more than
Just
that.
Understand that the billing's going to be inaccurate, and
it's a little more than that.
I'm sure it is.
Actually, I think I can forthrightly say that this is an advance payment on, a payment that would be made anyway, just in future years. in that ADS bills, kind of unlike any other agency bills. By that, I mean, they bill in arrears, okay?
For the SLA.
For the SLA charges. So it's kind of like when someone shows up to mow your lawn, they send you a bill and you pay it. Well, for most of state government, we say, all right, in FY26, here's what our expenses are going to be. And here's what we are asking in our budget. ADS does that for a component of their budget, but for SLA, which is largely data charges, Microsoft software charges and the like, which are big, they bill in this year's budget for last year's usage. So what we're asking, and actually to be fair to Secretary Riley Hughes, I mean, she's been asking for this. She's, been a secretary for a year now. When she came into the department, it took her a little while to, figure out where everything is. And she wants to put, kind of wants to move budgeting into kind of a methodology that reflects how they do business. So one problem, though, to move from billing in arrears to billing prospectively is you got 1 year, you're going to have to pay 2 bills.
Like
Okay,
veterans
got it.
home.
Yes,
So
I got it.
this, I mean, but again, I would argue, and this, you can choose to agree with this or not, but I would argue that this is not new money, but it's money that we'd be paying anyway. It's just that we're paying it forward, I guess is a better way to put it.
We're giving it to ADS to pay for $15 million worth of services they would bill they would have otherwise billed in FY27 in arrears. Instead, they'll be able to cover it in the same year without running a deficit that they then need to hang on departments the following year, because otherwise there would be this double billing that would then really mess up the budgeting of for each agency and department. So you'd have a 1 year double bill spike and it would, so that's
Not unlike truing up the liquor fund,
Exactly.
the deficit.
I mean, you're absolutely right. And it's the kind of thing that we would do if we can. I mean, the JTOC transfer elimination, same thing. These are things that we would do if we could. And so we're trying to use money because we have it, because we can, in a smart way to make, kind of government run.
I just read this as a whole new $15 million software program. And
No.
so, thank you.
Yeah, it sounds.
Lynn, did you have?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm just saying, does that mean next year, 2027, in the 26 budget, BAA, we won't see these big numbers for SLA?
oh,
Why they
We're
make it
not-
so
we're not
much?
promising that.
those will be based, those bills that they receive in FY26 will be based on whatever their services are being received now. And I'm not sure what those will look like. So this is not, this is actually to affect FY27 bills.
Right, so 26.
So we're
here
looking
and
ahead.
27, and theoretically, we pay them correctly.
What they will have, so what there will be is a really large, like doubling or more of the amount that is billed through the internal service fund allocation. That's a statewide allocation statewide. If that's going to double in FY27 based on the new model, we've got to make sure their SLA bills have an offsetting decrease in FY27.
Yes.
And that's why we're trying to do the transfer into their fund so that instead of hanging onto these bills to plan to pay them, to charge them out the next year to back charge, they'll just pay Microsoft in the same year next year because they'll have enough. They won't create a deficit. I mean, the way it works too, and why we want to reduce it is, I mean, just think about it. They're running huge deficits. They're spending out all these, the money this year that they don't bill to recover until next year. And it's doing this leapfrog. And we're trying to, the hard part is how do you move from arrears to current year? And this is a big step to try to do that. It is hard to get your head around, and there's some sticker shock. There certainly was for me. But I think the idea is that this is a one-time transition and why it's being described that way.
Next year, when we sit in front of you, we'll present an ADS budget that's quite substantially different from how we present it this year. I think it's a good thing. And again, I think Secretary Riley Hughes will come in here and she breathes fire on this stuff. This is important to her. And I think it's a good thing to do. And again, we do it because we can this year, and it may be in future years, we may not have that available revenue. So I wanted to take a pause there. I know I kind of went through somewhat eclectically of the initiatives, but I wanted to make sure that there were no questions on that before we moved over to transfers and reserves, which is kind of the also, substantial general fund uses, but I wanted to make sure I didn't skip anything.
Okay, I think
Okay, if there are,
we'll try to finish this up before 4 so we can be
yeah,
done.
that sounds like a,
Maybe I think-
We're gonna do the language.
It isn't here. Did I get the language?
Madam Chair, we're here until
Otherwise, I
tell
will.
us not to be.
Be careful what you wish for.
So the final section, these are transfer and reserve maneuvers that are most of them being, really mechanical, required by statute type mechanisms. I think the one that really doesn't fall into that category is the first one, which is a transfer from the Cannabis Regulation Fund to the general fund of $5.9 million. So when you see the number in parentheses, you can picture that as money coming into the general fund as opposed to going out of the general fund. When we look at transfers. And this one, to explain it in detail in an understandable way, I hopefully don't eat too much of my budgeted 10 minutes until 4 o'clock. But you may recall in the FY 25 budget, and we just looked at this in BAA, there was a transfer from the Cannabis Regulation Fund into the general fund that when Act 113 was passed, it was originally envisioned to be $12 million, and it ended up being more than that. It ended up being 15.4, I think, and we crossed out and adjusted that number in BAA. What that transfer was actually, that's not, that's based on a balance left in the Cannabis Regulation Fund at the end of FY 24. You may recall in 2022, Act 185, I believe it was section E126, because I still have nightmares about trying to parse through it. There's a rather complicated structure set up to provide sort of interim funding for the Cannabis Control Board, because they were originally, as established in statute, they were supposed to be funded only by the Cannabis Regulation Fund. The source of revenue to the Cannabis Regulation Fund are the license fees and registration fees for growers and dispensaries and so forth. And the excise tax was always envisioned as going all to the general fund. It has not worked out that way, I think in part because there was actually legislative action to hold down the fee amounts and, for licenses and so forth. And so that was intentional to actually constrain the revenue. And so we've had a situation for a number of years now where the Cannabis Control Board operating budget is quite a bit more than what's collected in the Cannabis Regulation Fund. So for the past couple of years, the legislative change in that E126 was to say, okay, all the excise tax, instead of going to the general fund, it's all going to go into the Cannabis Regulation Fund. We'll dump it all in there along with the growers' fees and those smaller amounts, the whole 20 million of revenue, whatever, that would have gone to the general fund from excise tax. It's all going to go in this fund. And then we'll wait until the end of the year. We'll see where the dust settles. Then they'll spend, meanwhile, their operations, they'll spend out of that fund. At the end of the fiscal year, after closeout, so really after the fiscal year closes, Commissioner of Finance and Management, sitting to my left, will, prior to July 31st of the following fiscal year, determine how much is left and sweep it into the general fund. And when we do so, we'll also make sure that 30% of that is being allocated to substance misuse prevention efforts, and the balance will just be revenue. So it's kind of a weird construct, and that's why we're showing it down here as a unique transfer as opposed to being like a current year source up on the sources side, because this is actually based on, this is going to happen in FY26 after the close of FY25, but it's actually dealing with revenue from FY25.
Right.
And
So it's down.
it is dramatically, eagle eye there. And so to get into the story on that.
Sales are down?
No, it's not at all. So what's going on? So first of all, there is a policy change being proposed that you'll find in the language document,
Okay.
which is instead of, for both the excise tax going forward, why don't I start there? We're going to create a new special fund. And for that excise tax that's collected, that's supposed to start going to the general fund in FY26. Instead of having it all go into the general fund, but then we're supposed to kind of appropriate 30% of whatever that amount is, VDH first, we just set up a special fund and we're just going to say, okay, all the excise tax, 30% goes into a special fund at VDH. It will be far more less administratively complex,
Right.
more budgetarily transparent. So with that, Madam Chair, this represents only 70% of what would have gone to the general fund. The other 30% will be revealed in a transfer to the special fund. However, there's still another 4 million missing from this. And what we're proposing to do with that is to actually leave it in the Cannabis Regulation Fund and not sweep it. And the reason we're leaving it is $4 million approximately is what is projected to be the gap for the Cannabis Control Board's FY26 operations between what they expect to take in the Cannabis Regulation Fund license and fee revenue and what their operating budget is. So a number of moving parts there. What we landed on was to propose just leaving it in their fund, not sweeping it all, leaving them enough to get through FY26. However, there is in the FY27 budget, we will essentially have to fund them somehow. If you don't wish to cut their size of their operations in half. So there may be a general fund transfer required or some other mechanism. But what we're doing is just reducing the amount of the sweep to the general fund, leaving them enough so that when they go into FY26, we know they're funded through FY26. So that's why there is such a change here. We are, however, though, I believe it's $20.8 million of excise tax revenue. Well, actually, it'd be 70% of. So there's about 14 million, I think, that's in that general fund number.
Yeah.
That the very first line at the top of page 14 in the economist's forecast.
Right.
The excise tax, it hasn't been for a couple of years been in our revenue forecast. Now it is. Now it is going to be, and we wanted to leave it there, frankly. And that's why we're leaving this fund balance for them in FY26 so that we can actually have the excise tax roll into the general fund and this new substance misuse special fund in the same fiscal year and no longer be waiting for the end of the year, doing a transfer and all those machinations. So any other questions on that line? I promise that the following lines will be simpler.
Okay, so let's see.
Okay. The next line is an $81 million number, which is not small, but that's a transfer to the General Obligations Bonds Debt Service Fund that in FY25, for the first year, we started handling this as a transfer rather than as an appropriation. And I will just note on this, this is up almost $10 million from last year's amount, which is significant. So more borrowing, higher interest rates. is the short story there. We've got the $14.881 million transfer to the Capital Infrastructure Fund. So that's based on the formula of 4% of prior year appropriations, less debt service, which is that 81 million number. And this is the amount that's left over that represents that transfer. The next line is a formulaic transfer to the Tax Computer System Modernization Fund.
It seems very high, but we'll get into that when we get to.
It's formulaic.
I know.
It used to be, and I don't know if you remember the history, but
Yeah.
they used to just skim off the top.
Yeah.
You never saw it as a line item. It used to be a percentage of all collections. And so they were diverted directly and never went to the general fund. With the new model, it's a transfer that's transparent out of the general fund. And this is according to a formula that I'm sure they can walk you through in their budget.
Yeah, we've changed it over the years.
0.02%,
Yeah, exactly.
up to 0.02%. Doesn't have to be that amount, exactly.
The next item is the only, I guess, kind of deficit mitigation type transfer this year. It's a relatively small amount, $185,000. But we felt, I think, that it was more appropriate to make this a one-time transfer rather than cover some pressure with general fund increase to Fish and Wildlife. This is basically to cover some special fund pressure. I think the shortest story with only a couple minutes on the shot clock would be they are embarking on a restructuring program. And we hope that they will, at the end of that process, be better aligned in terms of revenue and their expenses. And in the meantime, this prevents any rifts or actions like that taking place in FY 26. So
We'll hear more from them, sure.
the next two reserve actions are, money actually coming back to the general fund. So we've got to take some funds actually unreserved out of the budget stabilization reserve because we've hit the statutory cap in FY 26. So some of that flows back and becomes available, about 1.4 million. And a similar maneuver from is unreserving funds from the Human Services Caseload Reserve. That's actually a rather complex, it's all according to statute. It's very complex. I could send you an email and a chart on that, but it's probably not what I want to start trying to explain right now.
We'll hear Anybody who wants to stay and talk to Hardy about the details is welcome.
And not the most exciting aspect. The final line is, what's being reserved in the 2753 reserve. I guess the only thing I will say about the caseload reserve adjustment is that included in the change in caseload reserve, some of that is actually has to be used by statute to help fund the 53rd week of Medicaid. So it's sort of moving from one reserve into another and freeing up a little bit of general fund for other uses. But that brings us down to the bottom line, as it were, and you'll see remarkably, the total general fund uses appears to match to the dollar, the figure at the bottom of page 14. So
thank you.
I do think that if we did our operating statement correctly, we actually left you guys $108.
Oh, you're the.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks are on Adam. I'm going to change the subject.
and 74 cents.
Oh, 74 cents.
Rounding. We've all gotten a lot of troubling news out of Washington today. They were freezing grants. I now have learned that all Medicaid portals are down in all 50 states, plus DC. Medicaid portals are down across the country. So I know you don't have an answer to this, but it's on people's minds. It's now, it's creating havoc, uncertainty, unpredictability. I know you guys are aware that things could continue to happen down there. And if you just want to share, like, what's the administration doing to think about how to respond to, goodness knows what we're going to have to respond to because we don't even know. But now we have two things today, all the grants and Medicaid.
Technical thing or?
No, they have frozen, they've blocked it. You cannot get into Medicaid right now. That's a big deal.
This is actually, that particular piece of news is news to me, but I can tell you that this morning we actually were talking about this with our friends at Human Services, who you would imagine probably have the most to bring to bear. Something like 1.6 or $1.7 billion of federal money goes into our Medicaid program. So there are a couple of things they have going for them. One, we just talked about our caseload reserve. And that is one, certainly reasonable use. Two, they're about as aggressive as you can be with their draws. That I figured is actually once a month, but actually I think it's more frequently than that. It may even be every week. So they've drawn down prior what they could. The third and final bit of encouraging news, you heard today the governor mention that our cash balance at the state is about $1.6 billion. That is all obligated, or not all, but most of that's obligated. So it's not like it's sitting there for nothing. However, it is now unused,
Right.
and we do not anticipate a chunk of that will be used. So if we need to draw down on that, we can. That would be a most unfortunate situation.
Yes.
I will tell you that, because, to draw down on that, we would ultimately have to figure out what its uses were for, and we'd have to rescind those. So
And then we'd have to pay it back.
anyway, we're
Pay interest.
on it.
Interest.
Sorry.
Yeah, and
Yeah, you lose interest, but also you'd have to figure out, well, that money was probably for IIJA or some other project that it just ain't going to happen if we need it. So we're on it, but we're in the same situation you are. And financially, we're in as good a shape as we probably could possibly be in. But the plain truth is, if the federal government is going to reduce payments to us in various programs, we don't have the financial horsepower to do them ourselves. We just don't.
that's right.
Oh
So you guys are thinking about that and
yeah,
how,
but we're not
Plan B,
we're not
plan C.
panicking about it. We're simply saying, here's what we
yeah,
can bring to bear, and
yeah.
we
Just adding to the uncertainty and unpredictability of this entire budget. Maybe the budget adjustment too, I don't. Yeah.
This is nationwide.
Yes,
I mean, we're not alone, so I'm sure
We're
there's
not.
gonna be interaction
We're not.
between.
and I'm sure there are, all 50 states, I can't imagine any state is happy about this.
Yeah, the good news,
But it's harming people, and so hopefully this will get resolved.
all 50 states have congressmen and senators. And sure, they will be hearing a mouth or an earful.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we'll see. But we're well aware and we're doing our best.
Okay,
On that note, there's a section upstairs by the agricultural producers.
oh,
It's popped up on my calendar. It might be some. Hopefully, it's probably good. We're really in short supply.
yeah. So, thank you very much. We'll be talking to you.
We have language you have on your, on our website, and so you can print out. And also, we didn't get to the one pager if, for one time, so I'm happy to go through that, or, a lot of that is self-explanatory, but I'm really happy.
For today. So thank you both very much, committee. We are meeting at 9 tomorrow with the Human Rights Commission. Then Adam will be back in with the capitalization of the medical insurance fund. And then we are going to do a lot more work around budget adjustment. We've got to make another big leap forward. We've done good work so far, but we got a lot more to go. And tomorrow, we also, if you need to meet with people, committees, agencies to get answers to the budget adjustment, and you need to go in and out, please do it. The priority is to get your areas figured out. And language. Don't forget the language.